Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are going deep into a history that's often been hidden or even erased. We're going to look at how the rigid idea of just two genders came to dominate, what knowledge was lost along the way, and, sadly, the violent impact that still ripples through our world today. So, let's get into it.
You've probably seen a message like this on a web page. But what if it's not a website that's blocked? What if it's an idea, a piece of history, or even a person's right to exist? That feeling of being shut out, of being denied, that's really at the core of what we're talking about today.
So, where does this kind of blocking even start? Well, a lot of the time, it kicks off with an attempt to define reality in really narrow, really strict terms. Let's take a look at a pretty recent example. So, back in 2018, this was the objective to get a federal definition of sex on the books that was, permanent, strictly binary, and based only on your anatomy when you're born. The message here is pretty clear. There are only two choices, and those choices are locked in for life. This was an attempt to write a very specific, very limited view of human identity into law. And that brings up a huge question, right? Is this super rigid, two-option only view really how things have always been? Is this what science, tradition, and history have always told us? Well, when you actually dig into the historical record, the answer might really surprise you. It's a big no. To see what I mean, we can look at some traditions that are thousands of years old. And what we find is that they saw human identity in a much, much bigger way. You might think male, female, that's it. But in classical Jewish legal texts like the Talmud, they didn't just see two sexes. They identified at least six. And these categories weren't seen as mistakes or something wrong. Nope, they were just part of the natural variety of being human. Rabbis actually discussed how people from all six of these genders would fit into society, from things like getting married to inheriting property. And this kind of nuanced understanding wasn't just in one culture either. Take Hinduism, for example. The Hijra community has had this sacred, recognized place for centuries. They aren't defined as men or as women, but as a third gender, a completely distinct identity with its own spiritual importance. But here's where we see this painful clash with the modern world. On one hand, you have the Hijra community, who are traditionally revered. People literally ask for their blessings at weddings and births. But on the other hand, today they face incredible discrimination and are often pushed to the margins of society. And a lot of this shift comes from the legacy of British colonialism, which came in and imposed its own rigid, binary laws and attitudes on a culture that had a much broader view. Okay, so this is the key question then. If all these powerful ancient traditions recognized this kind of diversity for centuries, what on earth happened? How was that knowledge lost? Or maybe more accurately, how was it destroyed? This timeline shows one of the most tragic and deliberate acts of that destruction. In 1933, Nazi-aligned youth groups stormed the Institute of Sexology in Berlin. This place was a global center for research and advocacy for LGBTQ rights. And they didn't just close it down. They dragged its entire library, all the research, patient files, decades of knowledge, out into the street and set it on fire. A full century before those fires, the poet Heinrich Heine wrote that just an absolutely haunting and prophetic line. And his own books were in that pile of 20,000 being burned. It's this chilling idea that destroying knowledge, erasing an idea, it's just the first step. The next step is destroying people. And that horrifying link between erasure and violence isn't just something from the history books. It has a direct, tragic, and measurable cost right now, today. Let's just look at the data. This data from the National Crime Victimization Survey is just stark. The rate of violent crime for transgender people is 86.2 per 1,000 people. For cisgender people, it's 21.7. That's over 4 times higher. It's not a small difference. And when you zero in specifically on violent crimes motivated by hate, the gap becomes even more shocking. The rate for LGBT people is 8.3 times higher than for non-LGBT people. This isn't random violence, it is targeted. The U.S. Transgender Survey gives us an even more devastating look at the lifetime risk. Just look at this. It shows that nearly 1 out of every 2 transgender people will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Let that sink in for a second. 47%. But these are not just numbers on a chart. What does this actually mean for a human being? Behind every single one of those statistics is a person, a life, a story. This quote from activist Iridescent Roni it hits the nail on the head.
She explains how when a person's identity is treated like a political debate topic, it chips away at their humanity. It makes their very existence seem optional. And that's what opens the door for so much harassment and violence.
And for her, this wasn't some abstract idea. This is what it actually looked like in her life. Her personal information and her family's was posted online. Her dad got nonstop threatening voicemails. She got death threats. She was stalked for months. She even had to be put on a special police list to prevent someone from calling in a fake emergency to her house, a tactic called swatting that can be lethal. And all of this, the long history of erasure, the deliberate destruction of knowledge, the horrifying data, and the very real violence people face, it all leads us to this one final, incredibly powerful question that Iridescent Roni asked in her testimony. It's a question that ties the past directly to our present, and we're just going to leave it with you to think about. Thanks for watching.